Hey there, I'm your host, the Bread Pirate. Ever since Breath of the Wild came out in 2017 for the Wii U and Switch, it's had me, as well as a lot of other people in the community, scratching our heads. It changed a lot about the series and created the question of what is a Zelda game? Is it a medieval fantasy game, or is it an action game? Is it about exploration, and does the story even matter? The franchise has certainly come a long way since its roots on the NES, but what really has changed? Today, we're going to be diving into this question by comparing the original Legend of Zelda to Breath of the Wild. This, however, is only part one, so sit back and relax as we talk about Overworlds and Dungeons. If the Zelda series has been known for anything, it's the sprawling overworlds it has. And despite being made for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1986, the original Legend of Zelda is no exception. In Zelda 1, the overworld was divided into 128 different screens on an 8x16 grid. Going from one corner of the map to the other took about 2.5 minutes, which might not sound like a lot, but in reality it would take a lot longer to cover that distance until you got to the end of the game, since you would constantly have to deal with enemies, mazes, and distractions which could potentially lead to secrets. And as many players already know, Breath of the Wild is the exact same. Instead of a grid like older games though, Breath of the Wild is divided up into 15 regions, in total taking about 45 to 50 minutes to walk from one corner to the other. The small quote-unquote problem with both games and walking that distance though, is that you're always bound to be distracted and thrown off course, whether that's due to enemies, mazes, secrets, or any other number of things that you can do in the overworld. In other words, both overworlds have a lot of interactivity. In Zelda 1, it was blowing up walls, burning trees, investigating statues, and checking out caves. And in Breath of the Wild, it's blowing up enemies, hunting wildlife, investigating Korok puzzles, and finding shrines, which is honestly only scratching the surface. Additionally, both games boast a wide array of environments, such as deserts, mountains, coastlines, and deep forests. Each is filled to the brim with NPCs to discover, and enemies, which correspond to specific biomes, such as levers, which are only found in sandy areas, and Lynels, which are only found in the mountains. However, in Breath of the Wild, these biome-specific enemies are usually reskins of enemies that you find in other places in the overworld. Yeah, but that's a topic for the next episode when we're going to be talking about enemies and items. No spoilers! Now, we've talked a lot about the similarities between the two overworlds, but there also are a lot of differences. For instance, in Zelda 1, the entire world isn't really accessible from the very start of the game. A lot of people like to say that the game gave unrestricted exploration, but that's just not the case. A number of locations require the raft in order to be accessed, and almost all of northwestern Hyrule is off limits to the player until they learn how to either escape the Lost Woods or get the ladder. And that's not even taking into account the sheer amount of enemies you'll have to face along the way, which are likely to kill you multiple times. So yes, you can go to most areas of the game from the very start, but unless you've already played the game or have a game guide, you're not going to know how to explore those areas, or how to get to them. Contrary-wise, Breath of the Wild is a game where you have the entire map open to you once you finish with the Great Plateau, and I mean the whole world. In the select few areas of the map where extreme temperatures can prevent you from progressing, you usually find the item you need in a nearby town or stable, making the hurdle of extreme temperatures non-existent unless you decided to enter the region from a weird angle or you missed the item that you needed. The only location that we can sort of say is off limits to the starting player is Hyrule Castle, but that's technically a dungeon. Yes, dungeons. We're not there yet. We'll get there in a minute. So, in essence, Zelda 1 had a much more restricted overworld than Breath of the Wild. There are a couple other small things which we could say differ between the two, but all of those things pale in comparison to the largest difference between the two overworlds: importance. See, in Breath of the Wild, the overworld is the main focus of the game. Everything either revolves around it or is a part of it. It takes a spotlight. But in Zelda 1, this wasn't really the case. Instead, there was another huge part of the world which was just as, if not more, prominent. And I think many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Dungeons! Dungeons in the Zelda series are the equivalent of levels from other franchises. They're the place where Link can test his combat skills, solve puzzles, and explore strange ruins. In the original Legend of Zelda, there were 9 dungeons, which were literally called levels at the time. All of them were mandatory, but the first 8 could be done in any order you wanted. Once those were finished, then the 9th and final dungeon would be unlocked. In Breath of the Wild, though, things are a bit different, and also a bit more complex, because Breath of the Wild has 4 types of dungeons. 136 shrines, 5 divine beasts, Hyrule Castle, and the Trial of the Sword, if we're counting this based off of DLC. Out of these dungeons, only 4 shrines and Hyrule Castle are mandatory. The 4 shrines are mandatory because they're part of the tutorial, and Hyrule Castle because it's the final dungeon, which houses the big bad evil guy. All the other dungeons are optional, even if they're highly recommended. This is the major reason why I say that dungeons in Zelda 1 were a more important part of the world than they are to the world of Breath of the Wild. To put things into perspective, the overworld in Zelda 1 is comprised of 128 screens, but all the dungeons put together have 236 screens. Effectively, this means that 2/3 of the game is filled with dungeon exploration. In Breath of the Wild, however, they took a different and not necessarily worse approach by focusing on smaller, less prominent dungeons that they scattered throughout the world. On that note, let's talk about how these dungeons are framed. In Zelda 1, dungeons are semi-linear mazes where you have many possible paths to take, but usually there's only one path which will lead to the piece of Triforce you are seeking. Along the way, you have to deal with enemies, traps, getting lost, and secret entrances, which are typically optional but sometimes are necessary in order to progress, such as level 7, where you need to bomb 4 different walls in order to get to the boss. And I should probably mention this, at the end of every single dungeon, there is a boss. Funnily enough, every single boss in Zelda 1 eventually returns in the game as a mini-boss later on. Aside from Ganondorf, of course, but that's because he's the final boss. Can't really have another boss after the final boss. It doesn't work. Math, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. Switching to Breath of the Wild, let's talk about shrines. They're best described as mini dungeons which feature 1 or 2 challenges. And to make things more confusing, shrines can be divided into 3 categories: combat shrines, blessing shrines, and puzzle shrines. In a combat shrine, you face off against a single guardian scout and then you get your reward. Very simple. In a blessing shrine, the challenge comes from how you enter the shrine. Thus, a shrine itself, if it's a blessing shrine, offers very little challenge, so we can largely skip this one. Then there are puzzle shrines. These are the most dungeony of all the shrines since they can feature exploration, combat, and puzzles. Most puzzle shrines only feature a single room though, so they're very limited. The best way that I can compare a shrine to a Zelda 1 dungeon is that a shrine is like a single room of a larger dungeon from the original game. That's not a perfect comparison, but it kind of gets the point across. Next up are Divine Beasts, which are the major dungeons of Breath of the Wild. In the base game, there are 4, but a 5th one is available as DLC. Alright, I know there's a huge disagreement about whether a Divine Beast should be even counted as a dungeon or not. But for today's episode, we're gonna skim over that debate, okay? Awesome. If you understand how shrines work, then Divine Beasts are very easy to grasp. It's like Nintendo strapped together a bunch of shrines and then made a dungeon out of it. Enemies pose very little threat in Divine Beasts, and most can be defeated in a single hit. Each Divine Beast has 5 terminals that a player has to interact with, and once all 5 are activated, then the boss can be completed. In other words, it's a lot of puzzles. Some of these dungeons have multiple rooms to them, while some of them are made out of a single large chamber. It's very hard to get lost in a Divine Beast. Hyrule Castle. This is the final dungeon of Breath of the Wild, and it's the one that everyone can agree counts as a dungeon. Rather than focusing on puzzles like the previous 2 dungeon types, Hyrule Castle is much more combat and exploration focused, focusing only on the simplest of puzzles. It's just an absolute labyrinth, and it's easy to get lost, even if you have a map. Additionally, harking back to the original, this dungeon has secret entrances, so if you weren't lost enough already, now you have to navigate through even more passageways. This dungeon also has the highest concentration of tough enemies out of anywhere in Hyrule, so if you're looking for a challenge, you came to the right place. Of course, there's always the final fight with Ganon at the top of the castle, but that fight is really a topic unto itself. Overall, Hyrule Castle better resembles the dungeons of the original Legend of Zelda than any other dungeon type in Breath of the Wild. And I don't believe that's a disputed point in the community either. It just is the closest, for better or for worse. Trial of the Sword. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is a weird addition to the list. Unlike all the other dungeons in this video, the Trial of the Sword is a gauntlet of combat chambers, each presenting a new variety of enemies and challenges. There is zero exploration involved, and instead the challenge is in just trying to survive through the numerous floors it has. Complete Chamber 1 and you go to Chamber 2. Complete Chamber 2 and you can go to Chamber 3, and so on and so forth until you complete all the chambers of a given difficulty, choosing between beginners, middle, and final. If you've ever played Twilight Princess, then you could think of it like the Cave of Ordeals, or if you're into Wind Waker, then it's kind of like the Savage Labyrinth. A lot of Zelda games have a mini dungeon like this, so yeah, we're gonna add it to the list. Alright, now that we've gone over all of the basics on these dungeon types, here is a full compare and contrast list. Unfortunately, dungeons and shrines are being combined because I ran out of room. I hope you'll understand. Up next, let's talk about how rewards are handled in each of the dungeon types. In the original Legend of Zelda, each dungeon had a guaranteed item hidden inside, a boss which drops a heart container, and a piece of the Triforce, which is what you need to finish the game. Yet this pattern was not always a rule. Sometimes you would find a secret room filled with free rupees, or an old man who could sell you an upgrade to your bomb bag. Particularly interesting is that some dungeons featured more than one dungeon item. Level 1, for instance, houses the boomerang and bow, and the final dungeon holds the red ring and silver arrows. Weirdly, most items you find in dungeons aren't required to complete the dungeon they're found in. Thus, a lot of the rewards are completely optional. I would also include the old man's hints as a pseudo-reward, cause in rare situations, they can legitimately point the player in the right direction, or help them find an item in the overworld. The ultimate objective of every single shrine is to get spirit orbs, which are Breath of the Wild's version of a heart or stamina piece. Additionally, you can find clothes and weapons inside of chests, and by simply discovering a shrine, you unlock the ability to teleport there in the future. Similarly to the shrines, after you defeat a boss in a Divine Beast, you will get a full heart container, as well as a champion's ability, which is a useful new ability that can help in combat or exploration. You could also find weapons in Divine Beasts, but these are optional, same as in shrines. Hyrule Castle has a lot of different rewards, but none of them are necessary for completion. Among these rewards, you have a few clothing items, late tier weapons, Korok seeds, and side quest information. So although everyone agrees that Hyrule Castle is a dungeon, it has some of the least impressive rewards out of any of these dungeon types, because most of the rewards you get are either breakable or very minor. The Trial of the Sword has one reward: Master Sword upgrades. As you complete all 3 of the difficulties, the Master Sword gets more powerful. Very simple. Aesthetic. Obviously, there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of dungeons and the overworld, but I want to end on the topic of aesthetic. If there's something we missed, we'll probably cover it in the next episode, which is going to be about enemies and items. So, aesthetic. Yeah, what the heck is it? Well, it's the way a dungeon looks and how it stands out compared to its sibling dungeons. In the original Legend of Zelda, there was not a lot that could be done in this regard, but the developers certainly tried in giving that medieval fantasy vibe. For starters, every single dungeon in Zelda 1 has a unique color palette, so that gives you a little bit of color variation, yay? The types of enemies you fight in these dungeons also changes. As an example, Dungeon 6 is known as the Wizrobe Dungeon because it has so many wizard enemies, and it is also where you find the magic wand. Meanwhile, Dungeon 1 is unique because it has more Goria and Stalfos than any other dungeon, and it's where you get the boomerang, which is the signature weapon of the Goria. And finally, Dungeon 9 has custom music, which really sets the mood for it being the final dungeon. Breath of the Wild is a little bit different though. Shrines, Divine Beasts, and the Trial of the Sword all share a very similar aesthetic: sci-fi. It's not even low sci-fi, this is like high sci-fi, alien technology looking stuff. Shrines and Divine Beasts are mostly identical to each other. Divine Beasts have a little bit more variation though, since they have custom music and environmental hazards. So kudos to you guys! The Trial of the Sword is also very similar to the Shrines and features a sci-fi vibe, but it doesn't have any custom music or anything. Instead, it features overworld music. And then we have Hyrule Castle, which is without a doubt the most unique dungeon in Breath of the Wild. Instead of going with a sci-fi vibe, Hyrule Castle leans very heavily into a medieval fantasy dungeon crawler vibe, fit with its own music. But it should be mentioned, as with Hyrule Castle and all the other dungeons in this game, none of them have unique enemies to them. Shrines and Divine Beasts only use Malice and Sheik-Attack enemies, and Hyrule Castle has a bit of a mix of everything, as well as Trial of the Sword, which it really has a mix of everything because it's a gauntlet. But they don't have any unique enemies for any of these environments. So to summarize aesthetic, the original Legend of Zelda tried, but didn't have a lot at its disposal, and Breath of the Wild had a lot at its disposal, but kinda went with the same vibe with everything except Hyrule Castle. Holy crap, that took forever! If you enjoyed this, consider leaving a comment. I respond to every single person. We also have a Discord where you can talk with me if you have lots of questions you want to discuss, or you want a voice chat. That's in the description below. That one, yeah. Until I see you next time, have fun storming the castle.